with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker today. We have Derek Young. Derek is a PhD candidate at the University of California, Davis. His research is focused on understanding the impacts of climate change in the Californian forests. He emphasizes work that can help inform forest management in the face of environmental change, which is why he's joining us today. And I do want to mention, so we took a poll at the beginning, and most of our audience, 72%, is coming from California. We've got I think 1 or 2 international participants, and then 17% from the Western US. So this is a fairly California-centric topic, and it makes sense that a lot of you guys are from California. Before we get started, let me do one more poll just to see where people are, what their affiliation is. I know this isn't this. There might be a lot of other categories, but if you can loop yourself into a federal agency, state agency, academic, NGO, or just other, just curious to see who's joining us. Thanks for all the participation. This is exciting. Give it a minute or two here. Okay, more like 30 seconds. All right. Again, not surprising. About half of you guys are coming from federal agencies, a quarter from state, and then a quarter academic, and then a 6% or so of NGO. So that's good. This is the first time I've used this poll. It looks like it's a good grouping for people, so thanks for that. All right, I'm excited to hear all about this. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the screen over to Derek. 1 second here. All right, give us a second while we switch screens.
All right. I think
Wonderful.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, and you sound great. All right, I'll let you take it away. Thanks, Derek.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stacy, and thanks everyone for tuning in. So I'm going to talk about some of my dissertation research that I'm just wrapping up, and as you can probably tell from the title, post-fire forest regeneration and restoration under climate change. I'm going to talk about 2 separate but closely related questions that sort of form the general outline of my talk. The first question is looking at natural post-fire regeneration and how post-fire recovery patterns might change with climate change. The goal of this is to get a better understanding of when we can depend on natural regeneration and when we might expect regeneration failure as climate changes. And then the second question is focused on managed post-fire restoration, specifically situations when managers are planting seedlings to speed up post-fire recovery. I look at how to select appropriate seed sources or genotypes for post-fire planting projects, again, given that climate is changing. So I'm going to start with the first question, the natural regeneration. So the work I'm going to describe was the result of a major collaborative effort with lots of people, so I want to acknowledge all my collaborators listed here, as well as our field technicians and the great Forest Service staff who helped to facilitate this research, as well as funding from the Joint Fire Science Program, UC Davis, and the Forest Service. So I'll start with a little background. So many of the important Sierra Nevada tree species, especially pines, primarily established soon after wildfire, especially moderate severity wildfire and high severity when there's seed sources available. But fire suppression has had a huge impact on fire regimes in California. The amount of area that burns every year has dramatically decreased from pre-European to contemporary periods, and that's allowed fuels to build up so that when fire does burn, a much greater proportion of it burns at higher severity. And these high severity burns often cover large contiguous patches like you see in this photo. This is from the Plumas National Forest. And so I did say pines do tend to primarily establish following moderate to high severity fire, but that's only when there's a seed source available. And with these large contiguous patches of high severity fire, seed sources can be few and far between. And it's been shown repeatedly in this system that when you're more than about 250 feet or so from a seed source, natural tree regeneration is essentially non-existent. When you're closer to a seed source, you can get appreciable regeneration, but there's also a huge amount of variation in that regeneration response. And so I was interested in what explains some of that variation, especially focusing on the influence of climate and climate change and how that might affect regeneration patterns. So there's been some recent work looking at how climate change might affect post-fire regeneration. And there's a few potential outcomes we might expect. One is that climate change the additional stress of climate change could reduce establishment or recovery of forest following fire. But an alternative is that fire could remove established trees and open up opportunities for new, better adapted trees to become established and thereby help to maintain resilience of the forest. Or finally, climate change could have little impact. Post-fire regeneration trajectories could just carry out as they always have. So there's been some support for each of these outcomes, but we still don't yet have a broad understanding of what to expect when. And so I designed a study to help shed a little more light on this question. My general research question was, can wildfire allow forest communities to reorganize in response to climate change? But that's a pretty broad, hand-wavy conceptual question. So I operationalized that in terms of a study design by asking, how do the weather patterns in the years following wildfire influence regeneration patterns? And this is the key to my approach. It's based on the regeneration that we see following fire that was followed, for example, by unusually hot, dry conditions like a drought, could give us a window into what regeneration would look like overall in an on average hotter, drier climate. And so we can hypothesize what our observations of establishment under climate change might look like. So if we were to start with a tree species distributed along an elevation gradient, and say we have a fire that's followed by drought, so during the establishment period, conditions are hotter and drier. One option is that we could end up with reductions in establishment throughout the range of the species. An alternative is that the fire could by opening up these opportunities for recruitment for establishment, it could allow the trees to expand their range upslope and sort of as a natural response to climate change, potentially along with a reduction in establishment at the lower elevations as they get hotter and drier. So I looked at these patterns in mixed conifer forests in California, and I studied 4 different groups of vegetation primarily. First is pines, which are generally more fire resistant, at least when they reach adult stage, and for the most part are shade intolerant. And that contrasts with shade tolerant conifers, which are more fire sensitive even in their adult stage. Hardwood trees, mostly oaks, that can be completely top-killed by fire, but then almost always vigorously resprout from the root crown. And then shrubs, which can also resprout or germinate from seed that are stimulated to germinate by fire. And in contrast to shrubs, the conifers in this system don't resprout, and their seed bank lasts for at most a year. So they're completely dependent on seed dispersal from surviving trees nearby burned areas. So shrubs are usually seen as competitors to tree seedlings, especially the shade intolerant pines. And when post-fire tree regeneration is poor, the alternative vegetation state is usually shrubs. After severe fires, we sometimes end up with situations like this, where you get nearly 100% shrub cover and very little conifer regeneration over large areas. And this can last for decades. This photo was taken over 20 years post-fire in an area that was previously forest. So there's concern that if climate change results in reduced conifer regeneration, we might end up more and more often with areas that look like this post-fire, which could potentially represent a type conversion from forest to chaparral if it remains in that state for a long period. So now I'll describe what I did to address these questions. So we surveyed regenerating vegetation on over 500 plots across 14 different wildfires that burned in Northern California across a range of years from 2004 to 2012, which is a period that encompassed a lot of variation in annual weather patterns, which means we also captured a lot of variation in the post-fire weather from one fire to the next. we quantified that post-fire weather as in terms of an anomaly, or specifically the extent to which the average precipitation in the 3 years following the fire deviated from the long-term average precipitation at each site. And so that's what's shown in on the y-axis here. It goes from unusually wet post-fire to unusually dry. Each point here is a survey plot from our study fires. If the post-fire precipitation was exactly average, then we'd have an anomaly of 0, the dashed orange line. 2 of our study fires burned in 2012 at the beginning of the drought, and those fires were the most anomalously dry of all of the fires that we surveyed. Oops. One second, what did I do? But then we also sampled along this axis of long-term average precipitation, or normal precipitation, which, so we have plots that were on average, sites that are on average dry and then on average wet. And then so sampling along both of these axes at the same time allows us to address our questions about whether the response of regeneration to post-fire drought, for example, differs depending on where you are across the landscape. For example, at the lower versus upper elevation limit of a given tree species. We also tested other variables besides precipitation that could be ways of representing moisture availability or water stress to plants, but we found they result in generally the same conclusion. So for the rest of this talk, I'm just going to focus on precipitation as our climate variable. And then, as I mentioned, we focused specifically on moderately to severely burned plots that were within about 250 feet of the nearest live reproductive tree, in order to focus on sites where there could potentially, at least potentially, be a source of seeds for tree regeneration. And so now I'll jump into what we found. So the only individual tree species that showed sensitivity to post-fire weather was white fir. This plot shows the predicted probability of white fir regeneration on the y-axis as a function of the post-fire precipitation anomaly, from unusually dry post-fire to unusually wet post-fire. And then the colors depict the long-term average precipitation, so that we have predictions for sites that are normally wet sites, so upper elevation, and then normally dry sites. So the first thing to see here is that there's a big difference in height between these two lines, the difference in the y-intercept. This isn't new. This is just showing there's more white fir regeneration in wetter sites, but we know there's more white fir in wetter sites. What's really interesting here is the slope of these lines, the response to the post-fire precipitation anomaly. We actually see reduced regeneration of white fir following fire when conditions are unusually dry post-fire. And we see this in both wet and dry sites, but a much stronger effect in the wetter sites. So this is actually the opposite of what we'd expect with a upslope range expansion. We would expect increased establishment in the wetter sites. Here we actually see more strongly reduced establishment. So we don't see that signal of natural shifts to track climate change. So white fir was the only individual species that showed a detectable sensitivity to post-fire weather, but when we can look at functional groups of species, we see more sensitivity. So here we have shade-tolerant conifers, which includes white fir and has very similar patterns, and then pines, which also show reduced recruitment under post-fire drought, but the more muted response, and that makes sense with our general understanding of pines as potentially more drought-tolerant group of species. But again, for both of these, it's a reduced establishment under post-fire drought across the board. And then with hardwoods, we did not detect any sensitivity to the post-fire precipitation anomaly. These trees going to be a lot less sensitive, and that makes sense because these trees can resprout from a large established rootstock that's probably a lot less sensitive to drought than the roots of a little conifer seedling that just germinated. And so because they're not dependent on seeds for post-fire establishment, hardwood trees will probably be able to persist much longer through climate change and disturbance than the conifers that depend on germinating from seed. So then we also looked at establishment of other vegetation types. Here we have shrub cover and grass cover. These vegetation types are present to at least some extent pretty much everywhere. So rather than predicting the probability of there being any regeneration, we predict the percent cover. And we see in the case of both of these vegetation types, increased establishment under post-fire drought. We show a gray line for shrubs because shrub cover was not sensitive to the long-term average precipitation, just to the post-fire precipitation anomaly. In the case of grass cover, we see this increase in cover under post-fire drought is mostly in the drier sites, lower elevation sites. And these results make sense when we think about these species as being generally associated with hotter or harsher sites. And but it's really interesting to me that even a brief period of harsh conditions following fire can lead to increased dominance of these vegetation types. So to summarize our results so far using the same little schematic, we tend to see a decrease in establishment of conifers under post-fire drought, and these decreases occur throughout the species, across the landscape. We don't see a reduction more in one site than another. Hardwoods appear not to be too strongly affected. Shrub and grass cover appears to increase under post-fire drought. And the fact that these different vegetation types respond in different ways suggests that we might expect a shift in the overall community composition and possibly even type conversion with climate change, so that fire in the future under climate change might be more likely to result in situations like these patches dominated by chaparral. But I need to throw in the big caveat that there's still a lot of variability around the average response. So this is by no means the guaranteed outcome. It's just our results suggest that this might become somewhat more common. So when looking at the responses of individual species or species groups one at a time, it can be a little difficult to predict overall community shifts. But we can use community analysis tools. This is correspondence analysis to look at the factors that influence the overall composition of the regenerating tree community. So for this analysis, I defined the community composition using the abundances of seedlings of the 4 most common tree species across all of our plots. So those are the blue, bold letters here. When if you move towards one direction or another, that indicates greater dominance of one species over another in the regenerating tree community. And then we looked at the influence of different environmental variables and how those explain those differences in dominance of one species over another. And so we see an influence of the long-term average climates, normal temperature and normal precipitation in sort of the direction we'd expect. So under higher normal temperatures, we tend to see an increase in dominance of yellow pine in the regenerating community. When in areas that are normally wetter, we see increased regeneration of white fir and sugar pine. So this makes sense, but in a way it also doesn't make sense because these seedlings, they don't have any idea what the long-term average climate is. They only know what conditions were like while they've been alive, and that's rarely the same as the average. So what I think is going on here is that the long-term average climate does influence the species composition of the surrounding forest that survived the fire, and that can influence regeneration through seed dispersal. But to test that, we also surveyed unburned reference plots in the forest surrounding the burned areas, and we quantified the abundance of adult trees of each species. And so those are the black species codes here. And we see, I think, this remarkable correspondence between dominance of a given species in the unburned forest and then dominance of seedlings of that species in the regeneration nearby. Douglas fir, yellow pine, and then white fir and sugar pine. Pretty tight link there. So this implies some sort of biological inertia, some control of the existing vegetation that could constrain the potential for post-fire regeneration to respond to climate change. And then finally, we see precipitation anomaly as well influences regeneration in similar direction as the long-term average precipitation. So, on average wetter sites, we see more white fir and sugar pine, and also when it's unusually wet post-fire, we see more white fir and sugar pine. But we can look at the amount of variation explained by these different variables. We see that these long-term climate and adult tree species abundance variables explain a lot more of the variation in the regenerating community than the post-fire precipitation anomaly does. Although we do see an influence of post-fire drought, it's pretty weak in comparison to the influence of these other variables. But this analysis is just looking at relative abundances of tree species, assuming that they're present in the first place. I suspect that once we incorporate shrubs and hardwoods and other vegetation types, we'll see a stronger effect of that post-fire anomaly in explaining transitions from one state, a forested state to a non-forested state. So to summarize what we've seen so far with this project, we see that increasing aridity resulting from climate change could lead to a decline in conifer establishment, an increase in shrub and grass dominance, and that the declines in conifer establishment seem to be across the board. We don't see any signal of range shifts or upslope range shifts with under warmer, drier conditions. And it seems that the site factors like the long-term climate and adult species composition have a stronger influence on the regeneration patterns. So these results suggest that forest response to climate change, at least at the regeneration stage, will actually be pretty slow, even when we have a severe disturbance like wildfire to create opportunities. And as a result, we might end up with type conversion to chaparral a little more often than we have currently. And then in terms of tree species composition in areas where regeneration is strong, it seems wildfire doesn't act to reset the stage of species dominance quite as much as we would think, since the presence of nearby adult trees can strongly influence those patterns. And because of this, it's possible that the response of forests to climate change might end up being manifested more through the response of adult trees as opposed to seedlings. And maybe our idea of seedlings as being the most sensitive life stage needs to be revisited. That's something we've seen with mortality of adult trees resulting from the recent drought. Adult trees are dying even in sites where seedlings and saplings are surviving. So, and then these results also imply that even if we think tree species composition should change to keep pace with climate change, it might not change on its own. And even in places where natural regeneration is strong, it might not be of the desired species mix, and management intervention like seedling planting might be necessary. So that's my segue to the second part of my talk, which is looking at tree planting. And so in the areas where we expect regeneration will be poor and we want to speed up forest recovery by planting seedlings, where should we get our seeds from? So this is switching gears a bit to thinking about tree genotypes and seed zones. And I hope to convince you by the end of this that we need to move beyond thinking about seed zones and elevation bands and get a lot more specific about the environmental conditions that seedlings might be adapted to. So, when choosing seed for a post-fire restoration project, managers have a lot of options. The Forest Service nursery in Placerville has a huge collection of conifer seeds collected from all over the state. The Cal Fire Seed Bank in Davis also does as well. These are collected in anticipation of a future need for restoration. Each separate collection is called a seed lot, and it's defined by the seed zone where it was collected from. So this is a map of the seed zones of California. And then seed lots are further defined by the elevation band where the seeds were collected. The elevation bands are defined in 500-foot increments. So an example of a seed lot might be ponderosa pine from seed zone 301 from the 4,500 to 5,000-foot elevation band. And when replanting following fire, the standard Forest Service practice has traditionally been to look at the seed available in the Forest Service collections, and then select the seed lot whose seed zone and elevation band most closely match those of the planting site. And the motivation for this comes from a large body of research that shows a relatively strong local adaptation in trees along climatic gradients. To conceptualize this idea of local adaptation, imagine a tree species that's distributed along an environmental gradient, in this case, a gradient in elevation with hotter, drier conditions at low elevations and cooler, wetter conditions at the higher elevations. Now think of each of these icons as a different population of this one tree species. The first thing that's important to recognize is that not all populations are identical. There's potential for local adaptation in these populations where each population might be best adapted to the site where it occurs. So for example, if we were to take seed from each of these populations and then plant them up at the high elevation site, we would expect to see that the seed from that high elevation site would do better than the other source populations because those trees are already adapted to those cool, wet conditions at that high elevation site. And then the reverse, at the low elevation site, the lower elevation trees might be adapted to those hot, dry conditions, at least to a greater extent than the trees from other populations. So we would expect those trees to do better. This is often observed in studies of trees along climatic gradients, and this is what has led to the traditional practice of using seed that's collected from near the planting site. This works well when climate isn't changing, but the catch comes in with climate change. So imagine that conditions get hotter and drier everywhere. So I just changed this color scale, and so now each of these populations finds itself in a climate that's hotter and drier than the one that it's best adapted to. Now, if we were to take trees from all these populations and plant them at the high elevation site, we might expect the lower elevation trees to do better because they're already adapted to those hot, dry conditions. So because climate is changing and because the tree seedlings that we plant now will hopefully remain on the site for decades to a century or more, we have to think carefully about the policy of planting seedlings that are adapted to the historical climate. And in the last 6 years or so, the Forest Service has begun recommending planting seedlings from seed lots that originated from about 500 foot below the planting site, with the logic that they might be better adapted to the hotter and drier conditions at those upper elevations in the future. But to help determine whether this approach makes sense, the Forest Service initiated an experiment, and I'm going to focus for the rest of this talk on that experiment and the results. So in 2011, when replanting following some severe wildfires, 4 national forests agreed to try planting seedlings from multiple different seed sources at their post-fire planting sites. The plantings always included a seed lot that originated from as close to the planting site as possible, but then they also included 1 or 2 lower elevation seed lots. Depending on the forest, this test was done for between 1 to 3 species, and then 2 to 3 source elevations or seed lots for each species. So for example, on the San Bernardino National Forest, they planted 1 species, happened to be Jeffrey pine, and then 2 seed lots. 1 was the local elevation, and 1 was from a lower elevation. And then on the other extreme, Klamath National Forest planted 3 different species and 3 seed lots of each. Overall, across all of these forests, more than 3,500 seedlings were planted. So I went to measure these seedlings the year after they were planted to record their baseline sizes, and then I measured them again 3 years later to see how much they grew. And coincidentally, this was not part of the design, but the entire 3-year period between my 2 measurements, California was in a severe drought. So by looking at how the seedlings responded to those unusually hot and dry conditions, we could gain some insight into how these trees would perform in a future climate that's on average hotter and drier. So it could help us to evaluate whether this idea of moving seeds up in elevation would make sense as climate changes. So to explain how I approached this question, I'm going to describe the details for one of the species at one of the sites. I'm going to focus on incense cedar planted on the Klamath National Forest. I know a lot of managers in California might find it odd that planting incense cedar, but because in some areas it does so well or too well on its own under fire suppression, but it is planted on the Klamath, and the setup with incense cedar just works really well to explain some of these patterns. So the incense cedar trial involved 3 seed lots, what I call low, mid, and high, with the high elevation seed lot being from the same elevation band as the planting site, so 4,500 to 5,000 feet, and the planting site was at 4,650, and the other 2 being from lower elevation bands. So to understand how local adaptation might affect performance of each seed lot in the field, we first needed to understand the climate where each seed lot came from. But to do that, we needed to know where on the landscape the seeds could have been collected from. So for that, we can use the seed bank records like what we see in this table, which give us the seed zone, the ranger district, and the elevation band where the seeds were collected from. So we can start with the seed zone. So they all came from seed zone 301. So back to our seed zone map. Seed zone 301 is this red highlighted region, which makes sense because it's the same seed zone as the planting site, which is this gray star. So now we can zoom in on that seed zone, and next we have ranger districts. They all came from the Happy Camp Ranger District. So here's the ranger district boundaries. This is the Happy Camp Ranger District. So we can zoom in on that, and now we can use the elevations. So I'm going to swap out this nice aerial photo for elevation map. So now this gray shading reflects elevation in 500-foot bands. And using this, we can plot out all the potential areas where these seed lots were collected from. So now I use the same 3 colors, the blue, purple, green, blue, purple, green, to reflect the 3 seed lots in their elevation bands. We know that each seed lot was collected from somewhere within its respective outlined area, but we don't know where within that area, at least based on these digitized records that are available to managers when they're making these decisions. So the first thing to notice is this is a really large area. There's a wide range of locations where seeds might have been collected from. You know, the green, the high elevation seed lot could have been collected from here, or from here, or from here. Or worse, it actually could be collected from all of those locations. A lot of the seed lots are actually comprised of pooled collection of seeds from multiple locations within a given elevation band, which, as we see, can be a pretty big area. But this is unfortunately the most specific that Forest Service managers can get right now when when selecting seed lots, at least based on the digitized seed lot data, there is some potential to refine the locations further based on the notes on the paper seed collection data sheets in the file drawers at the Placerville Nursery. And I can discuss that in more detail later if there's time and interest. I'm not going to go into it now, though, because that I found that additional information is not always super reliable, and it's not in the digitized records that managers have available when they're making these decisions. So sticking with these elevation bands, once we've identified the potential areas where the seeds might have come from in geographic space, then we can look at the climate in those areas. So now this gray shading reflects the long-term average precipitation from the PRISM data set. So I'm going to take this image, move it to the side, and then add this graph. And now this graph reflects the potential climate space for each of these seed lots. So we have mean annual temperature on the x-axis, mean annual precipitation on the y-axis. And so, for example, this high elevation green seed lot covers a pretty wide area of especially mean annual precipitation, and then also some variation in mean annual temperature. So, for example, one site right here within the elevation band could reflect this point in our plot. Another area, much drier, could reflect this point. So wide range of variation. But then the next thing to notice is there's also a lot of overlap between the elevation bands, especially in terms of the precipitation. So if we take a point from this lower, or for the mid-elevation band, which is lower than the high elevation band, in some cases it is drier. So we're looking at this axis of precipitation. But in many cases, points in the mid-elevation band are actually quite a bit wetter than areas within the high elevation band. This is the opposite of what we aim for when we're selecting seed from lower elevations to plant up. We're selecting lower elevations because we think they might be adapted to hotter, drier conditions. So we see here, not necessarily the case with precipitation, also not necessarily the case with temperature. The issue is less severe here, but it's possible that there's some areas within the high elevation band that are warmer than other areas within the mid elevation band. So I want to jump to a hypothetical scenario here where, in this case, the elevation bands are actually adjacent bands. They're just 500 feet apart from each other instead of in our previous example where they're spread out by even, in the case of the two seed lots we were looking at, by 1,500 feet. Now they're all adjacent. We can plot the climate space, and we see there's a lot more overlap. So this shows that just going down in elevation does not necessarily guarantee that you are going from you're going into a hotter and drier site. And so one reason for a lot of this overlap is probably cold air pooling. So as you move down in elevation into valleys and basins, nighttime temperatures can actually decrease even though you're moving down in elevation. But because all we have to go on is the elevation band, we don't know if we're in a cold air drainage or not. So the best we have right now is the elevation band, and we see that's not so great. So I think that's why it's essential to move beyond using only the elevation band and seed zone to describe seed lots. I think we should make it a priority to record the latitude and longitude where each seed lot was collected. So we could actually pinpoint. We could say that the green seed lot was collected from this point exactly, rather than saying it could be anywhere within here. And then I also want to point out here that if we switch to using latitude and longitude, we wouldn't need to worry about seed zones, which are actually pretty arbitrary boundaries anyway. Like, they imply that going from here to here, like, oh, you swapped seed zones, but really it's just a couple, like, very short distance. Versus if you go from one end of a seed zone to another, that's actually a bigger deal. With latitude and longitude, we know exactly how much of a change that was. Okay, anyway, so going back to our actual experiment with these actual seed lots that have trees planted in the ground. And next, we'd want to know what's the climate like at our planting site. So we can plot that in our map. That's the gray star here. It's within the green point cloud, which makes sense because this experiment was designed so that the high elevation seed lot encompassed the elevation of the planting site. But we have to remember, ever since this experiment was initiated, California was in a extreme drought. So the long-term average is probably not necessarily relevant to these seedlings. We can also plot the recent climate at the planting site, and we see it was substantially warmer and substantially drier than the long-term average climate. So if we're looking at this, we might expect the trees from the mid-elevation purple seed lot to be the best adapted to the climate at that planting site, particularly when we're looking at the recent climate. So now we can look at finally what we actually found in these tree seedlings. So we see sort of something kind of surprising. The lowest elevation seed lot actually grew the best. So this y-axis shows stem volume growth, which I calculated based on measurement of the basal diameter and height of the stem, and then I statistically controlled for the initial size of the seedling and shrub competition. And so we see this increased or stronger performance, statistically significant stronger performance of the lowest elevation seed lot, which is surprising because it comes from a much warmer and possibly drier climate than the planting site, and possibly warmer and drier than sites where the mid-elevation seed lot might have been collected from. But I think a big, probably, so there's a lot of potential reasons for this. One big one is that we don't know where from within these seed elevation bands the seeds were collected. So the green seed lot could have been collected from here, the purple one from here, the blue one from here, and then if this were the case, the blue seed lot would actually be from a site that more closely resembles the climate of the planting site. And then another potential reason could be that the relevant environmental variables that these trees are adapted to are not mean annual temperature and precipitation like we've been using to define the climate space, but there could be strong local adaptation to more local scale factors like soils or disease or other climate parameters. But we do see over and over again in published studies that trees show strong local adaptation along temperature and precipitation gradients. So I think there's a good chance we're capturing a lot of the relevant climate variation, but we're probably not capturing this more local variation in soil type and disease prevalence and those sorts of things. So that's another potential explanation for this result. So we can repeat this analysis of characterizing the potential source climate for all of the trees that were planted on all of the different sites that perform this experiment. We can see that in general, again, lots of overlap. The lower elevation sites tend to be warmer and drier, but still lots of overlap. The mid to low elevation seed lots seem to be more in line with the recent climate of the planting sites, given that the sites have been in drought. So we might expect, in most cases, for the lower elevation seed lots to perform better. So we can see what happened. Now we're looking at all of the different species that were planted across the 4 different forests that did this experiment. And we see, first of all, there's a lot of variability. There's no consistent pattern. In 4 of the cases, we see there's a significant difference in performance among the seed lots. In 3 of them, so big cone, Doug fir, Klamath incense cedar, San Bernardino, Jeffrey pine, the lower elevation seed lots did perform better than the higher elevation local seed lot. In one case, the Angeles ponderosa pine, the high elevation seed lot actually performed better. So I think it's clear by now that just by using lower elevation seed lots does not always guarantee that we'll end up with better performing seedlings, even when we're talking about growth in an unusually hot, dry climate. I think also actually maybe more interesting here is the fact that most of these species did not show significant differences in performance. And so this could be for a lot of the reasons we've covered. There lack of specificity of the collection locations. It's also so it's possible that the climates where these seeds were collected were not distinct. It's also possible that seed lots were comprised of bulk collections of seeds from multiple locations within an elevation band that could act to dilute any signal of local adaptation within any given elevation band. And then finally, and I think actually most likely, is there's a lot of environmental variation in the planting sites out there. These are real-world post-fire silvicultural conditions, which are really variable. Here's an example of one of the sites. This is on the site on the Plumas National Forest, where there's downed logs. There's a lot of variability in shrub cover, differences in soil across a small spatial scale. So this experiment, this is not a typical meticulously controlled scientific greenhouse study. This is representative of real-world management conditions, and it seems a lot of the time the heterogeneity of the environmental conditions actually swamp out any variability in performance due to the seed lot differences. So from one perspective, it might actually not be that important to differentiate among seed lots, at least ones that are relatively close to each other. But that variation might become more apparent as the seedlings get older. Maybe that's when the differences in local adaptation really show up. So to summarize our results so far from this study, we found that planting seedlings from hotter and drier habitats into sites that are usually cooler and wetter tends to have either a positive or neutral effect on performance. But we have to acknowledge that this may be due to the drought. So ever since these seedlings have, or between the 2 points in which I measured these trees, these sites were in much hotter and drier conditions than usual. So this gave us a window into what we might expect from elevation transfers in a future climate that's hotter and drier, but we don't really have a reason to necessarily expect that these patterns would hold under the average contemporary conditions. So whether it makes sense to start moving seedlings upslope now in anticipation of climate change is still an open question. And there's important exceptions and caveats to our general patterns as well. We found that in at least one case, the lower elevation seed lot actually did worse. And given the uncertainty in seed collection locations, there is a risk of choosing seeds from a climate that's inappropriate for the planting site. And then secondly, more often than not, we actually detected little differentiation among seed lots. And like I said, this could be due to the range of variability in these real-world silvicultural conditions. And then again, it's possible that these differences might become more apparent, though, in the future as these seedlings grow. So in working through this project, a few opportunities for improving some practices have come to light. The big overarching suggestion is when selecting seed lots, remember that lower elevation does not always mean warmer and drier. And so just choosing a lower elevation band for your planting site, it's not necessarily the appropriate response to climate change. Then it's also important to consider the potential negative consequences of seed transfer, particularly this risk of introducing maladapted genotypes, either because we're not accurately characterizing the climate where they originated, or because those trees are adapted to variables other than the ones that we're thinking about, like soil type or pathogens in it. And then we also have to ask, are we managing for current climate or future climate? Do we want the trees we plant to be well adapted to the conditions now? Or can we get away with planting trees that are maladapted now in order to end up with trees that are well adapted in the future? And then finally, when collecting seeds, we should, I think, record more detail on the locations of the collecting sites. And we should avoid pooling seeds from multiple collection locations. Even if we think the best strategy is to plant seeds from a diversity of collection sites, I think it makes more sense to develop that portfolio at the time of planting rather than at the time of collecting seeds. But tracking separate collections and with more geographic specificity would definitely put a lot more burden on the nursery and the seed bank. So we need to make sure that they would have the resources for this. I know there is a lot of interest in doing this in the Forest Service. Arnaldo Ferreira, who works in the region genetics program, is even running some pilot tests of this approach. But they would need more funding for this to become the general policy. So finally, in case all of this just seems too infeasible, I thought I'd propose one alternative management strategy. Who knows, this might end up being easier. And then I want to thank all of the super helpful Forest Service staff who made this project possible, and acknowledge funding from the Forest Service and the National Science Foundation. And then I'd be happy to take questions now if there's time, or later by email as well.
All right, thank you so much, Derek. And I know coming from the science communication side, really appreciate the conclusions and recommendations on that side. Great kind of wrap up. So I'm going to try and post, let's see, I just sent a question out. Can you guys all, Derek, can you see that okay?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and read it, but just to make sure that you can reference it if you need it. So the first one is, oh, and by the way, feel free to type in other questions as we're going through. We do have a few minutes here, and if we go a little bit over, that's okay. And these questions will be part of the recorded session too, so if you do need to take off, you can follow up with them later. So the first one is, how many years do you look at for the wetter, drier than average periods? Is it the winter following the fire?
Okay, so I assume this question is referring to the first part of the study, the post-fire natural regen. And so we looked at the 3 years following the fire, and that included the winter following the fire, yes, and as well as the following 2 winters. The goal of that was to, to capture the moisture that's there for the very first cohort of seedlings that would be establishing it the next spring, and then the next few years after that as well.
Okay, great, thank you. Here's another one from Kevin. Did you look at the average first-last frost dates between the low elevation and high elevation site versus what actually occurred during the seedling growing period? I've always thought that over time, the lower elevation seed would suffer frost damage periodically, and that would retard their growth.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't look at that specifically. My thinking with that is at this scale, which is a relatively local scale when we're looking within a seed zone, or roughly that similar area of a seed zone, there's really tight correlation between the long-term average temperature along a elevation gradient and these other temperature-related variables like frost date. But you're right, that is getting more into the sort of mechanistics of how trees are responding to this environmental variation. So that is that's something that could definitely be good to look at directly. I think I'll do that. Thank you.
Great. Okay. The next one is, have you looked at other climate variables such as AET or climatic water deficit?
Yes. Particularly for the first study, we did. And we specifically looked at AET and climatic water deficit. And we found very similar patterns along those gradients. It seems that in this case, where we have fires, so our source of environmental variation or post-fire environmental variation comes from moving from one fire to the next, from one time period to another. And so those, for example, those fires that were followed by the drought they were very dry. Precipitation was really low, and that means AET was also really low. Water deficit was really high. They're pretty tightly correlated along the range of variation that we're looking at. And so I think that's why we got really similar results regardless of which variable we used. But yes, we did look at those. And then in the manuscript I'm writing up on this, we report the results for all of those variables.
Excellent, thanks. And I will put a plug into, if once those papers come out, be for sure to let me know, and I'll include links to them on the website for this event, which is also the place where I'll put a recording, and the YouTube, which I know it's still a long ways out, but if people remember and want that link, we'll make sure to include it and be in touch. So
great.
I'm excited. All right, we'll go on to the next question. I know we're getting close to the end of the hour here, but we'll just keep it going until we can't. Have you thought of looking at how much soil burn severity, I guess, let me start over. Have you thought of looking at how much soil burn severity there is in each fire? Seems that it would influence seedling success.
Yeah.
I guess in high severity, yeah.
That's a good question. I know that previous studies in the system, like Kevin Welch, he actually used a lot of the plots, and he was actually the one who collected the original data from a lot of the plots in this data set. He looked at some of these variables, including, I guess he quantified that in terms of litter depth and a few other variables. And that's written up. I'm not sure if that, specifically the effect of litter depth, is in the paper he recently published. That's one of the papers I cited in an earlier slide. But so I haven't specifically looked at that. I think some others have. I was focusing more on the influence of the post-fire weather and sort of by sampling across a large number of plots, trying to sort of sample over and sort of swamp out the variation that's contributed by those other factors. But I do know there's other studies looking at that. I can't report on the specifics of those right now.
Hey, you're doing great, so we'll throw you an easy one. Where was the cover photo taken?
This is the Plumas National Forest. This is either the Chips fire or the Rich fire, or it could possibly be both because they burned into each other. I don't remember offhand. I think it's probably the Rich fire.
Okay, great. All right, this one's a little bit long, so bear with me here. Forests like Klamath have a strong ocean effect with regard to temperature and precipitation. Do you think that affects those results with lower elevations being wetter, colder, while inland is generally hotter and drier? The forest like, oh yeah, so that's, sorry, that is the question, okay.
Yep, that's a really good question, and yeah, that's something I've been thinking about and expected that would come up as well. Yeah, I think that's probably a big driver of that variation in precipitation, and that's why I chose that site, because it works really well to illustrate these patterns. But like I showed with that hypothetical example with the adjacent elevation bands, even when we're looking at temperature or variables other than precipitation, we still get this substantial overlap in the climate that's encompassed within each elevation band, and we see that in the Sierras as well. But you're right. I think a lot of what was driving that precipitation overlap on the Klamath is that coastal gradient. But I should point out that it's not like a totally artificial example. That these are the elevation bands in the seed zone that the managers are using to select these seed lots. And so this is a real world case where that coastal to inland precipitation gradient really comes into play and could confound our decisions when we're looking for locally adapted trees.
Okay, and I had a few comments from Todd Drake. Wanted to mention that during the last year's seed collection, they recorded the legal location on the forms, and that they also, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, no, I just acknowledging that that's true. Okay. And that, yeah, what was the rest of that question?
And then also, they're just statements, just kind of clarifying. So they also mixed in some lower elevation seed rather than all lower.
Okay.
So I think this is one of your collaborators, right? And he just wanted to mention some caveats.
Oh yeah. Oh, okay. Right. Yeah. That's good. Thanks, Todd. Yeah. That's great. And yeah. So when I was referring to the paper records where we can get more specific about the seed sources, that's true. We do have township range and section, so assuming those work right, we can get to within 1 mile, square mile of the collection locations. But I had a lot of trouble using these. I found in a lot of cases the stated elevation band where the seeds came from didn't exist anywhere within that township range section. And then a lot of times the township range section wasn't within the seed zone that the seeds were supposedly from. So I got really frustrated by this and wondered if we can really depend that much on the township range section data. But let's talk more about that afterward, because maybe you have some ideas, or if anyone else does, I'd love to hear ideas on how to maybe use that information more reliably, and then also potentially incorporate that into the data that the managers have when they're selecting seed bots.
Okay, I'm going to do one last question here. It looks like we're winding down, but on the tree planting study, do the species for which you detected significant effects have a smaller environmental niche than the species for which there was no detected effect?
That's a good question, because that could explain these patterns. I didn't specifically look at the breadth of the niche. I do have an analysis where I plot that, though. So here we have the colors are irrelevant. Just look at one or another. So look at blue, for example. So with white fir, here's the distribution along gradient of normal precipitation, and then for yellow pine. So that niche, at least according to our data, and this is the regeneration, not the adult distribution, it does look like that niche breadth is a little bit wider for yellow pine, and that is the species that we saw showing less sensitivity to post-fire variation. So yeah, this could be a signal of maybe greater drought tolerance, as well as greater tolerance of wetter sites, which could translate to less sensitivity to post-fire weather variation. Yeah.
Great question, great answer. Okay, we are a few minutes over, so for those of us who are still with us, remember I will be sending out a follow-up email that will include any links you might need, and I also want to put a special plug-in that will have a link for a short evaluation. It takes a couple minutes, and it really helps us at the California Fire Science Consortium kind of figure out what kind of topics are the best, any technical issues that we need to resolve, and it also helps us to report back to our funding organization that these are impactful and meaningful. So when you get that, just click the link. Take less than 5 minutes. Really short, easy answers. So, if you have any other questions, Derek is graciously offered to answer them through email. So feel free to get in contact with him. But I think we're going to go ahead and stop for the day. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Derek, so much for a great presentation, and keep up the good work.
All right, thanks, Stacy. Thanks everyone for attending. Appreciate it.